How was he?
Fine. Same. Is there any news?
No. So what, we're not talking now?
I said what I have to say, Tony. If you can't be honest with me, at least have the balls to be honest with yourself.
Oh, I got balls. And as long as I do, they will remain intact. If you don't have faith in me, it's up to you.
You gotta prove it to yourself first, Tony. Yourself and God.
You know, you and God, Carmela, you're only religious when it suits you.
Oh, what is that supposed to mean?
Come here.
No, what is that supposed to mean?
The Pope doesn't even believe in Trojans, and you want me to get snipped. Isn't that a little bit hypocritical?
Look, Tony, I'm thinking of my family first. That's all.
Well, whatever's down here, it's God's creation. Isn't it a sin to undo the good work he's done?
Well, you should know. You made a living of it.
You're unfucking believable, you know that? Look what I made that living for. Hmm? What the fuck you doing? You had dinner an hour ago. What the fuck are you doing to yourself?
Tony, leave him alone.
I'm supposed to get a vasectomy when this is my male heir? Look at him.
Act 2. Chapter 6. Winds of War. They say that all true businessmen are sociopaths, that you can't maximize profits with a conscience, and there was no better example of that than Joe Profaci, a guy who milked the poor and invested those pennies into his own opulence. Giuseppe Joe Profaci was born in 1897 in Villabate, Sicily, and came over on the boat. His crime family, which would evolve into the Colombos, was the youngest of the five, formed as a legitimate business by Profaci. Carmine Mia, largest distributor of olive oil and tomato sauce in the U.S. He was already a very rich man when he branched out into organized crime, gathering up wealth and power as a bootlegger, bringing in whiskey by the boatload through Jamaica Bay on the southern shore of Long Island, and driving truckloads of the stuff in through Canada. His operations diversified into gambling, extortion, hijacking, prostitution, and exhorting entire unions, a form of shakedown that he might have invented. He'd been boss since 1928, when he was appointed at a National Commission meeting in Cleveland. By 1931, Profaci had a seat at that commission. He lived on a sprawling compound in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn. For decades, authorities thought Profaci was legit, but there were clues as to his secret identity. His name and address were found in the little black book of a mobster named Girolamo Adamo when he was arrested in L.A. Profaci himself was busted in 1938 when a commission meeting was raided in a Cleveland hotel room. Cops had no idea who they had, just that they also found 13 guns. Still, up until the Kefauver hearings, when Profaci's secrets were bared, he was mostly known as a good guy, a man who was involved in church activities and multiple charities. By the time he was arrested by New York State troopers at the Appalachian Conference in 1957, his secret might have been out, but he never went to jail. In time-honored mob tradition, Profaci became boss of one of the five families by bumping off the previous boss, Salvatore D'Acquia. Weak men were befuddled by obstacles, strong men removed them, and Salvatore D'Acquia was in Joe Profaci's way in 1928. Profaci was now boss of the smallest of the five families. Joey and Larry were also made in the aftermath of the Anastasia hit, but Joe Gelli was not. Mr. Profaci apparently didn't feel Joe Gelli had done enough to warrant a button. Now a made man, Carmine entered a chilly world, even tougher than the one he'd known on street corners. Carmine took over his own crew, and for the first couple of years, operations ran smoothly. Every once in a while, a little muscle was called for, but there were no log jams in the money flow. Scores went off without a hitch, not always like clockwork, but usually without injury or incarceration. Many of the scores were hijacks, considered good jobs for young hoods, because they were relatively easy to pull off. It took balls to do it, of course, but it wasn't complicated, not a lot of thinking involved. None of which took Murphy's Law into account. On July 28, 1959, Carmine's crew hijacked a truck with $50,000 worth of piece goods in it from the Acres Motor Lines terminal in Brooklyn, built right along the Gowanus Canal in between Nevins and Union Streets. At the time, it seemed like just another score, but in April 1960, an indictment was filed by a U.S. court in Kings County, charging Carmine and his crew, close friends and man-mountain bodyguard Hugh Apples McIntosh, plus Salvatore Albanese, Ralph Sparrow, Joseph Joey Maggs Magnasco, all from the neighborhood, and George L'Infante, who was originally from South Ozone Park, Queens, with hijacking and conspiracy to hijack. Thus began one of the longest and most complicated cases in the history of American justice. So allow us to step out of the chronology for a moment. 5 times Carmine and his co-defendants would go to trial over this crime. Joey Maggs was only around for 2 of those trials. After the second trial, after a conviction but before sentencing, Magnasco was shot dead. Much more about that later. At all 5 of Carmine Persico's hijacking trials, the prosecution's case hinged on the testimony of 2 men, Gaspar Vaccaro, a co-conspirator who'd taken a deal and turned against the others, and Edward Kennedy, an employee of Acres Motor Lines and the driver of the hijacked truck. He could testify that the truck had been hijacked, all right, but not to the identity of any of the hijackers, as he'd been forced to wear taped-over sunglasses. Vaccaro testified that on July 27 or 28, 1959, he was in a Brooklyn bar with Carmine Persico and the other defendants, and that they planned to hold up a truck carrying piece goods and take it to a garage they knew. It was a plan that turned out to be only almost perfect. Vaccaro spotted the truck at Acres Terminal as it loaded. Albanese fetched a previously stolen Buick. Vaccaro, with Sparrow and Albanese, followed the truck, and when the opportunity arose, kidnapped the driver, and drove the truck themselves to the garage. Albanese and Vaccaro drove the kidnapped truck driver around in the Buick until they were notified that the robbery was complete. McIntosh rented a truck and loaded the dry goods onto it. Carmine, author of the plan, was at the garage to help make the transfer onto the new truck. Vaccaro and Albanese called Joey Maggs and said it was cool to release the truck driver. Everything went off without a hitch. The stolen goods were sold to a fence, and minus the almost $2,000 in tribute, the 7 conspirators split the money. Then Vaccaro got popped and turned on his co-conspirators because he had priors and was threatened with a life sentence unless he blabbed. It was Vaccaro's testimony that troubled the defense lawyers. If the jury believed Vaccaro, checkmate. So they went all out to make Vaccaro seem bad and untruthful. The first trial lasted 12 days during the spring of 1961 and resulted in a hung jury. The second trial lasted 9 days that summer and ended with a conviction. Persico and McIntosh received sentences of 14 and 9 years respectively on each count, the sentences to run concurrently. Albanese and Sparrow received suspended sentences and were placed on probation. Maggs was convicted on both counts, but never had the opportunity to be sentenced. No one actually went to prison, however. There was a successful appeal. The second trial conviction was reversed because of errors at trial, those being both judicial and prosecutorial misconduct. The third trial was held in May 1963 and ended in a mistrial after the 8th day because, 1, there was a hung jury, and 2, Carmine Persico was hospitalized with gunshot wounds. Carmine got into minor trouble in December 1963 between the 3rd and 4th hijacking trials. A cop tried to pull him over for a traffic violation. Carmine hit the accelerator and allegedly ditched a gun. He was caught and booked at the Bergen Street Precinct Station. The 4th trial was the longest, lasting from January to April 1964, approximately 16 weeks. Carmine and 4 remaining co-defendants were convicted and sentenced by U.S. District Judge George Rosling in Brooklyn to 14 years and 9 months in prison. During the trial, the prosecution called Persico one of the most dangerous criminals in the East. Those verdicts were also overturned in appellate court because of errors in the trial judge's jury charge, as well as yet more the dreaded prosecutorial misconduct. Albanese's defense witness, a guy named Eppolito, died between the fourth and fifth trials. Eppolito's testimony was part of yet another attempt by Albanese's defense to make Gaspar Vaccaro look like a bad guy. The other part came when Mrs. Albanese took the stand and testified that Vaccaro had tried to rape her. Vaccaro was even impeached by defense witnesses for getting things wrong. He testified that when the truck was hijacked, it was parked on the Niven side of the terminal, so the defense put on a witness who said no, the truck was on the Union Street side. The fifth trial took place in courtroom 8C in Brooklyn Federal Court during April and May 1968, with U.S. District Judge John F. Dooling, Jr. presiding. Carmine was defended by Maurice Edelbaum, a Fordham Law grad considered to be a bit of a miracle worker. He had in 1962 worked tirelessly and pro bono for the freedom of one Isidore Zimmerman, a New York City doorman who spent a quarter-century behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. In 1967, Edelbaum successfully got a medical student off for the murder of his mother-in-law with an insanity plea, the story being that his client dropped LSD before the murder and wasn't responsible for his actions. But there were indications that luck was not running Edelbaum's way as he prepared to defend Carmine. He tripped on a rubber mat in the courthouse's entrance hall while leaving for lunch and fell heavily, breaking his arm. He was rushed to the Long Island College Hospital emergency room. The trial was delayed a week, and he spent the rest of the trial in a sling. Special Prosecutor Victor Warhide tried the case for the Department of Justice in Brooklyn Federal Court. Warhide would go on to gain fame as the prosecutor of Dr. Jeffrey MacDonald, who was supposed to have murdered his family, a case that spawned two best-selling true crime books, Fatal Vision and Fatal Justice. The fifth trial looked to spectators familiar with the first four to be a ho-hum affair. Then came the morning when there was extra security in the courtroom. The doors were double-guarded by armed deputy marshals. There were 10 marshals in all displaying sidearms. In addition, FBI agents and city detectives were sprinkled into the gallery. Spectators were searched before entering the courtroom, a commonplace practice now, but an indication of particular security concerns in 1968. Edelbaum complained about the show of force. "Your Honor, it looks like an armed camp in here." Judge Dooling all but ignored the comment and said, "Will the prosecution call its first witness?" Prosecution calls Joseph Valachi. That got everyone's attention. Valachi was already famous as the mob's first nationally famous rat. He'd been delivered to the courthouse by helicopter. His notoriety stemmed from his nationally televised gravel-voiced testimony before the Senate Investigation Committee in 1963. He introduced America to the term La Cosa Nostra, our thing, which he may have been using generically, but it stuck. Valachi told the world he'd been a made man since 1930, when he was 27, and he'd been inducted in the back room of a New York City restaurant. A gun and knife were on the table. Blood was drawn from his finger as he told his inductors, "If I talk, I die." His sponsor was Vito Genovese. For 32 years, he kept his lip buttoned. He spent 18 of those years in prison for burglary, robbery, assault, gambling, and dope. Carmine shot Valachi a nasty glance as a surprise witness took the oath, but Valachi made no eye contact. As history would have it, this was the only time Valachi ever testified for any prosecution. Carmine's defense immediately objected. Valachi couldn't testify because it was a well-known fact that he was nuts. Judge Dooling agreed to a brief competence hearing with the jury out of the room. "Who is the President of the United States?" Judge Dooling asked Valachi. "Still LBJ, right?" "What is today's date?" "It's about April 20, Valachi replied. "I'm guessing. I've lost track. I haven't been paying too much attention to that." He'd been in solitary confinement in Milan, Michigan, for the past 25 months. He was asked about a suicide attempt he'd made when he was first thrown into solitary. Was it because of disappointment that he hadn't been rewarded following his Senate testimony? It was a little of this and a little of that. There was a 30-year draft in my cell. I was cold and upset. Judge Dooling proclaimed Valachi competent and ordered that the jury be brought back in. Valachi's testimony revolved around statements he had heard by and about the defendants in April 1959 and June 1961. Valachi said Albanese told him that Chink, Ricardo, and Junior, Persico, went out with him on hijackings, including the Acres Motor Lines terminal job. Valachi said Junior was a street guy, always on the streets. He fought on the streets at a very early age, and he was always at his best outside. If there was business on the streets, Carmine was there. A tremendous earner, a guy with range, labor, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, hijacking, hitman. Of course, hitman, yes. Once Valachi testified, Carmine wanted some advice. He knew I'd been around. I knew who he was. He knew who I was, through friends. He wanted to know. First, he told me that he'd been paying taxes on all the hijackings that he'd been pulling, especially the one he was on trial for, Akers' truck. He paid Joe Profaci $1,800. He wanted to know if he was in his rights having trouble with Joe Profaci. And what did you say to him? I told him it was not taxes at all. It was an out-and-out shakedown, and he was 100% right in having trouble with Joe Profaci. Did Mr. Persico say anything to Mr. Albanese or to Mr. McIntosh in your presence? You told him in the future to pay attention to Joe. Listen to him. You want any advice, ask him. That's all. When he said Joe, to whom was he referring? Me. Mrs. Albanese did not testify at the fifth trial regarding Vaccaro's attempted rape because Valachi had already testified that Albanese admitted the rape story involving his wife had been fabricated. As Valachi testified, he was serving a life sentence for the murder of a cellmate he believed had been assigned to kill him. The underworld had a $100K price tag on Valachi's head, but Valachi got the assassin before he could get him. The victim could run but not hide, as the men shared a prison cell. The court was trying to keep the jury in the dark regarding possible organized crime connections. Best guess is that the jurors figured that part out on their own. The task became more difficult after Valachi testified. The press was out to sell newspapers and didn't care what the jurors knew and didn't know. Newspapers said the defendants were mob, that the case had been tried 4 times previously, and that the people at this trial were represented by a special prosecutor. Judge Dooling refused to call a mistrial because of the publicity, after individually interviewing each juror regarding what he'd seen and heard, and if it affected his ability to make a fair determination of innocence or guilt. The defense, of course, argued that the very calling of Valachi as a witness told the jury that this was a mob trial. The jury convicted across the board on May 9, 1968. It seemed to legal experts as if the fifth trial did the trick, but not so fast. The appeals of the conviction would take Carmine Persico's name all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. The 60s, as we'll see, might have been Carmine's best decade, but it was spent with the constant threat of imprisonment hanging over his head, and it seemed like no more than a week or 2 went by between court appearances. The appeals following the fifth trial were considered by the Supreme Court during its October 1970 term. The convictions of Persico, Albanese, and Spurrow were under scrutiny. Longtime friend and bodyguard Hugh McIntosh was also appealing, but under a separate petition. The case had set records for longevity, longest in New York Eastern District history. Surely there had to be a point where the gnaw-on-your-ankle-till-you-fall methods used by federal investigators and prosecutors came to a halt, a time for the U.S. government to say uncle. So among the questions the SCOTUS agreed to look at were the many trials, all 5 of them, the defendants were forced to endure. True, it was up to the prosecutor's discretion whether or not to retry a case if it ended in a mistrial. But after 4 attempts, and no clear-cut decision, a 5th trial could be construed as piling on. Shouldn't there be a point when it becomes a legal necessity for a prosecutor to concede defeat? Shouldn't something approaching double jeopardy apply? The appeal referred to the way the defendants were treated, now more than a decade past the crime, as overall unconstitutional aggressiveness. SCOTUS not only had to determine if the overall oppressiveness of the 5 trials was constitutional, but also if the 5th trial in particular met with the minimum standards of fairness, and that the springing of surprise witnesses such as Joseph Valachi, with a lot of La Cosa Nostra talk, had to have influenced the jury. The Valachi surprise was a prosecutorial ambush. The petitioner wondered if this didn't infer judicial misconduct as well, as it would have been impossible for the ambush to have been pulled behind the judge's back, and it certainly shouldn't have been pulled behind the defense's back. Didn't the 8 years between the indictment and the conviction in itself demonstrate that the defendants had been denied their right to a speedy trial? The answers to these questions were no, and Carmine eventually did a long stretch for hijacking. And now back to our chronology. There can be argument as to what gunshot or garrote started the Profaci-Gallo War, but the seeds were planted in 1959 when troublemakers Joey and Larry Gallo convinced Frankie Schatz that all of this tribute money going to Profaci was madness. Frankie Schatz said, yeah, he'd had it with Profaci, and he wasn't paying the tithe anymore. The Gallo said they would go to Profaci and get Frankie a better deal. That never happened. Frankie's numbers game, the same game that Carmine worked on when he joined Frankie Schott's crew, earned $7,000 a day, almost all in $1 bills. The numbers' popularity was the reason the government took it over, called it Lotto, and turned it into a voluntary tax. The numbers were making millions of dollars for Profaci, even as Profaci was alienating the Gallo crew with increasing tribute demands. When Profaci learned that Frankie Schatz had stopped paying tribute, he was a dead man. Profaci could be every bit as deadly as he was avaricious. Mutinous behavior needed nipping in the bud. A message needed to be sent. Tribute was to be paid promptly and in full, or else. Just to be cruel and to test loyalty, Profaci wanted a member of Frankie's own crew to do the dirty work. The Frankie Schatz hit was initially given to Joey Gallo, who turned it down, which sent a message to Profaci that Profaci didn't like. Joey said he couldn't do it. He was blood brothers with Frankie's kid Anthony. So Profaci went to Carmine, who said sure, he'd do it. On November 4, 1959, 8 p.m., Carmine was one of two shooters in the hit on Frankie Schatz. Twin gunmen plugged holes in Schatz as he exited his cousin's saloon, Cardiello's Tavern at Carroll Street and 4th Avenue. His cousin was Anthony Cardiello, who was tending bar. The shooters, in topcoats, fedoras, and masks, coolly followed the wounded Frankie as he retreated back inside and filled him with lead on the saloon floor. The shooters ran out, one of them dropping a .32 caliber revolver on the sidewalk, climbed into a car and sped away. Anthony, and the tavern's only other customer, dove behind the bar when the shooting started and stayed there until they were sure the shooters were gone. When cops arrived, they found Frankie Schatz prone in the sawdust, the barroom door splintered apart by gunfire. The medical examiner counted the holes. Frankie Schatz was shot 8 times, all striking him either in the face or the stomach. Since Frankie's rep with law enforcement was a man of chance, the first thing the NYPD did was round up all professional gamblers in Red Hook, guys who might have wanted to erase a debt or otherwise had a beef with Frankie. Had to be a local thing, a neighborhood thing, investigators figured. Frankie was a neighborhood guy. Looking back, maybe police were trying too hard to make it look like they were doing something, anything, when in reality the killers had nothing to worry about. 6 down-and-out, sleeping on the sidewalk men were arrested in connection with the murder and eventually were charged only with vagrancy. Joseph and Anthony Cardiello were brought in and held for a while as material witnesses, but they remained silent. Frankie Schatz was buried in Holy Cross Cemetery in Brooklyn. His grave read, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord." The site features a statue reminiscent of Michelangelo's Pieta, depicting Mary holding Jesus' post-crucifixion body. Whenever management becomes wealthy while labor suffers, there's bound to be trouble. Profaci lived in luxury, an Empyrean mansion in Florida, another in Homedale, New Jersey. The Gallos were hanging out in the downstairs club of a President Street tenement. It wasn't the cut of the rackets that got under the Gallo crew's skin so much as the personal tithe they were all supposed to come up with. It cost $25 a week to be in the Profaci family, no matter how low you were in the pecking order, no matter what struggles for survival your family might be enduring. Profaci wasn't a lovable father figure, the way some bosses were. He was more like Ebenezer Scrooge sneering, "Bah, humbug," to the folks of Red Hook. After Frankie Schott's death, the Gallo crew naturally figured they would get a chunk of the old man's rackets. But that didn't happen, widening the chasm between the factions. Control of Frankie's numbers went to Profaci's relatives, and the Gallo crew was out of work. The poor neighborhood got poorer, but Profaci got to build an extension on his Florida mansion. Chapter 7. Snake Eyes. August 1961, Profaci ordered the killings of Larry, Joey, and the rest of the Gallo crew, and it was then that the President Street boys realized that they had been betrayed by one of their own. There was a turncoat among them. We don't know the date, but the story goes that Frank Costello took one look at Carmine Persico and saw the future. The kid was going places. Costello called Carmine in. Carmine was fairly certain that he was going to be scolded about something. He didn't know what he'd done to piss off Costello, but whatever it was, it couldn't be fatal, right? Persico knew enough about Costello to know he had some serious balls. This was the guy who, from 1950 to 1952, testified several times on TV before a special committee of the U.S. Senate investigating organized crime and interstate commerce. This was back in the early days of television when the screens were round and everything was black and white. Costello was the only Don to testify. All the others took the fifth, and he came out of the hearings with a national reputation as America's #1 gangster. His testimony earned an element of mystery when cameras were ordered to show only Costello's hands and not his face. They asked him a lot of questions about his finances, how he lived such an extravagant lifestyle when he was making beans in the legit world. Costello danced as much as he spoke, eventually becoming so evasive that he served 11 months in prison for contempt of Congress. Now Costello had a vision, and it concerned Carmine, and Carmine liked the way it sounded a lot. Costello said that he was speaking as a true friend of Joe Profaci, and he was aware of the bullshit that was going on over on President Street. This Joey Gallo was nuts and would start a war, and when he did, the Gallo crew was going to lose. When that happened, Carmine wanted to be certain to be on Profaci's side, as his future was a bright one, and being true to Profaci was the most direct and certainly the healthiest path to take. Carmine, no doubt, didn't need to have any of this spelled out for him. He was adept at the chess game of life as well, and capable of thinking several moves ahead. According to legend, Costello went on to say that, if he really wanted to serve Profaci in the most efficient way, he would not make the move off of President Street just yet, that he should work as an intelligence agent, letting Profaci know what moves the Gallos were planning. Carmine said he understood. Sick of paying Joe Profaci, Joey Gallo came up in February 1961 with a bold plan. Frankie Schott's problem with the boss was that he hadn't been dealing from a position of strength, and it cost him his life. Joey and his crew would kidnap the top Profaci guys, Joe and Frank Profaci, Joe Colombo, John Shimone, Joseph Magliocco, and Sally the Sheik Musacchio. The Gallos would negotiate new and more favorable terms for themselves in return for the safe release of the detained mobsters. The plan, as it turned out, was overly complicated and had way too many moving parts. Not surprisingly, things didn't go well. On February 27, 1961, Joey and Carmine sent out a crew on a phalanx of limousines to make the pickups. This part went pretty smoothly. They kidnapped everyone on the list except for Joe Profaci. A little bird told him what was up, and Profaci fled to Florida. Joseph Magliocco pissed his pants while in captivity, a humiliation that left him with a lifelong hatred for the Gallos. After a few weeks of his captains being held hostage, Profaci made a peace agreement just to get them back. What Profaci didn't know was that Joey and Larry were at odds over what to do with the hostages, so much so that they came to blows. Joey didn't trust Profaci and wanted to kill the captives one by one, starting with Magliocco. Larry talked him out of it. Joey had been right not to be trustful. Joe Profaci had no intention of keeping his word. It took Profaci a few months to get around to it, but he eventually reneged on every promise he made to get his men released. In retrospect, the kidnapping scheme had been a devastating failure. All the Gallos had managed was a few false promises and some strong enemies. My dad, Rick DeMatteo, had always said that he loved Larry Gallo like a brother, and Joey Gallo was a maniac. But in this case, Joey had been right. Larry was naive. As it turned out, money wins over morality every time. And not just in organized crime. It was true in life in general. Larry's decision to be fair backfired. Profaci's capos returned to a crime family that felt humiliated, pissed off beyond belief. "I want every one of them President Street fuckers dead," Profaci said. That cheered the boys up. Like Carmine, the Gallos were fearless. On Sunday, August 20, 1961, Carmine Persico invited Larry Gallo to the Sahara Lounge, a bar on Utica Avenue in East Flatbush. Larry believed he was to discuss strategy regarding the upcoming struggles against Profaci. Larry had backup outside, but he wasn't expecting trouble, and, disregarding advice to the contrary, went into the bar alone. In the dim tavern, Larry found Carmine Persico and two others, Sally D'Ambrosio and 49-year-old John Shimone, there to meet with him. No one else was around, not even a bartender. Larry didn't know Carmine was going to be there, but discovering him there wasn't cause for alarm. He and Carmine were cool. While Larry was sitting at the bar talking to Carmine and Shimone, Sally came from behind, produced a 2-foot piece of rope with knots on either end, and wrapped it swiftly and savagely around Larry's neck. Larry turned purple and his eyes bugged. The audience made noises of encouragement, and Larry himself thrashed with taut muscles and emitted all his crunched vocal cords could muster, a high-pitched wheeze of distress. He looked to be a goner, until two cops, Sergeant Edward Meager and Patrolman Melvin Bly in a police cruiser, happened by. Back then, bars weren't allowed to open until Sunday evening because of blue laws, so seeing the bar's front door ajar prompted them to investigate. Bly stayed in the car and Meager went to check and see what was up. As he approached the slightly open door, he could hear the commotion inside, and when he walked in, he couldn't tell right away what was going on, because his eyes were slow to adjust to the dimly lit bar. "What's going on here?" Sergeant Meager said. "You open or not?" Larry moaned and slumped to the floor, semi-conscious. Carmine and everyone else, except Larry, who was down for the count, ran for the door with heads down, so all the cop could see was their fedoras. Patrolman Bly, watching from the police car, jumped out and chased the three running men to a nearby parking lot, where they climbed into a Cadillac. As Bly approached on the run, a gun emerged from an open window and shot Bly in the face. I heard the shot was fired by Sally. Published sources have attributed it to Carmine Persico. The caddy roared off. At that moment, Sergeant Meager emerged from the darkened interior into the harsh mid-afternoon sunlight, saw his partner down, and fired 2 shots at the Cadillac as it sped away. The car hauled ass for 2 blocks before the driver slammed on the brakes and Shimone either jumped out or was thrown out. The caddy then drove away to freedom, and Shimone, one eye swelling from the fall, was promptly scooped up by the law. Larry lived, but he had to go to the hospital for treatment, the rope having burned the skin off. There was a mark around his neck for the rest of his life. Police asked Larry who attacked him, and he said, "What attack? What happened to your neck?" "Got myself shaven," Larry said, his voice sounding like he'd gargled with rocks. Back at the Sahara Lounge, police found the 2-foot piece of rope with the knots on either end that had been around Larry's neck. In better light, it showed evidence of the ordeal, speckled with pieces of Larry's skin and stained by his blood. Bly was rushed to Kings County Hospital and listed in critical condition. Because of the cop shooting, the incident even made the out-of-town papers, and in Philadelphia, Larry was referred to as jukebox kingpin Lawrence Gallo, while Patrolman Bly, who recovered from his wounds, was said to have looked at a stack of photos and identified underworld figure Anthony Abadamarco, 39 years old, Abby of the President Street Boys, as the guy who shot him. This was a clear clue that the cops didn't know who was on whose side, not to mention an indication that Bly hadn't actually seen the shooter's face clearly. The same article said that the Gallos had fallen out of favor with the underworld and were marked for elimination. That part they got right. Apparently, the cop really did ID Abby as a shooter. Abby and Shimone were held. That slightly ventilated getaway car was abandoned and found to be registered to underworld figure Sonny Pepitone's 20-something girlfriend, Lila Lips La Pietra, who, with a cute shrug, said that she had no idea where the bullet holes came from. Police arrested everyone they could get their mitts on and held them as material witnesses in the shooting of the cop. That meant that Larry was being held on $100,000 bail for the attack on himself. Also held was Sahara owner Charles Clemenza. No one talked. Obviously, among those who got away and whose names were never publicly associated with the attack on Larry was Carmine Persico. Say that name out loud and you are dead. But Larry remembered who was there, and when he finally returned to President Street, out of earshot of the law, he said Carmine Persico was a dead man. Frank Punchy Iliano called Carmine the Snake that day, the first time anyone called him that, and the name stuck. Judge Samuel S. Leibowitz, who had presided over the Prospect Park murder case, was as merciless as ever and in charge of the arraignment of the material witnesses in the cop shooting. He made the connection right away between this case and Prospect Park. The judge, however, didn't mention names when he commented that the juvenile delinquents who'd given the cops such a bad time at the beginning of the decade had grown up. Now they're trying to murder policemen, Judge Leibowitz said solemnly. On the last day of October, police arrested 34-year-old Aurelius Serralo, and claiming he was the getaway driver, held him as a material witness as well. By November, it appeared the cops thought they had the incident sorted out a little bit better. They still didn't have Carmine's name in connection with the garroting of Larry, but they realized Bly's ID of Abby was off the mark, and Sally, not Abby, was indicted for the officer shooting. During the 24 hours after the attempt on Larry Gallo's life, someone took a shot at Joey Gallo's car. Joey wasn't in it, and the finger of Joey's top enforcer, Joseph Joe Jelly Gioeli, was delivered to Jackie's Charcolette, a restaurant run by the Gallo brothers' parents. Carmine had a new crew, and one of his boys was Freddie No-Nose, an ex-boxer who had taken one too many to the kisser and had no remaining cartilage in what used to be his nose. According to Sal Polisi, No-Nose, with Sally D'Ambrosio and Carmine Persico, was in on the Joe Jelly hit. Sally had a boat he kept at the man-made bulkhead harbor at Sheepshead Bay. He asked Joe Jelly if he wanted to go fishing in the ocean for blues. Jelly said sure, and left his girlfriend's house that morning in a relaxed mood. Jelly liked to fish. He'd gone fishing with Sally before, so he had no reason to think anything was up. He didn't even get it when he learned Carmine Persico and No-Nose were going out on the boat also. They came back with fish, but without Joe Jelly. Well, all but his ring finger. They turned it into a messy business, removed Joe's clothes, dismembered him, put the pieces in a 50-gallon drum and dropped the drum overboard into the Atlantic. Sally and No-Nose disappeared in December 1969 and were never seen again. Legend has it, they were garroted in a bar with no sunblind cop to come to their rescue. With the finger, they delivered the fish. Joe Jelly sleeps with the fishes. It was war with style, a riff caught by the Godfather. The Profaci family declared war on the Gallos, and the boys on President Street hit the mattresses. Carmine Persico was now officially Snake with the Gallos. Warring with the Profacis was courageous. The President Street boys had balls of titanium, no doubt about it, but Carmine and Profaci badly outgunned them. The Gallo crew slowly realized that Carmine Persico had betrayed them long before the attempt on Larry's life. He was a dirty double-crosser from way back, a spy, and probably the reason Profaci fled so he couldn't be kidnapped. The boys thought of the many times that Carmine had been there, an accepted and trusted friend, while everybody drank, and tactics and strategy were loudly discussed. And all the time the Snake was a human wire, transmitting intelligence directly to Profaci. How far back did it go? Was Carmine ever really their friend, or was he always a spy? There are many long and loud discussions on this subject in the social clubs of President Street, where chicken wire covered the windows so no one could toss through a bomb or Molotov cocktail. Evidence showed that Profaci wanted Carmine on his side very badly. He paid Carmine well to spy on the President Street boys, while Profaci planned his war. Besides the obvious advantages of being on the side that would win, Profaci guaranteed Carmine several lucrative rackets. Looking back at Carmine's behavior with the benefit of hindsight, it's easier to see that Carmine's allegiance was, as always, to Carmine. Sticking with Profaci was an excellent business move. The Gallo-Profaci war was raging, a war in which Carmine Persico was active, but, gauging by the public record, something next to invisible. It was a vicious business, gangland combat, but imperfect. During the summer of 1961, Carmine found a bomb under his car that never detonated. He had his car customized in case a second bombing attempt produced a working bomb, which it did. Near summer's end, a couple of guys tried to kidnap loan shark Ruby Stein, an associate of Nicholas Jiggs Forlano, but failed when Stein put up a noisy and attention-grabbing fuss. On September 21, 1961, members of the Gallo crew beat the shit out of Agnello della Croce, who was a capo with the Gambinos at the time, while he ate at Luna, a tablecloth restaurante in Little Italy. The next victim was Joseph Bagnasco, a South Brooklyn product, and Carmine's hijacking co-defendant. He was a solid player for the Gallos with hands of steel and a no-holds-barred type of attitude. Mags developed a deep hatred for Profaci early on and had joined the Gallos just as hostilities commenced. He bought it on a chilly evening in the autumn of 1961, only days before New York Yankees outfielder Roger Maris hit home run number 61 for the season, breaking the Babe's record, and the Yanks cruised to the American League pennant. The Dodgers had already been in California for 4 seasons, although New York was getting a new National League team in the Metropolitans the following spring. Joe Maggs was shot to death outside the Union Street Diner. His death graced the cover of my book, The President Street Boys, Growing Up Mafia. In fact, Joey Maggs' death is one of my first memories. I was there, just 5 years old, with my mother visiting my mother's girlfriends, Chicky and Lillian, in their apartment, and we were standing 20 feet away when Joey Maggs was wasted. An informant talking to the FBI said that he believed the hit on Maggs had been intended for Joey Gallo. The gunmen were inside the diner, and Gallo and Maggs got out of their car. Maggs went into the restaurant while Gallo crossed the street to say hello to someone he recognized. The same informant said that Profaci's man, Charles LoCicero, had been opposed to Larry and Joey Gallo being allowed in the family from the start, despite the Anastasia hit, that he felt the Gallos and their crew, who were mixed ethnicity and religion with Irishmen, Syrians, and a dwarf, were not the right type of people. The informant said he'd been to meetings between the sides held at the Golden Door restaurant at Idlewild Airport, now JFK, and that these meetings were marked, really ruined, by the antisocial behavior of crazy Joey Gallo. Even before the meetings, he'd known that a civil war was on the horizon, because Carmine Persico and the Gallo brothers had approached him about quitting Profaci and going on their own. One of the best photos of all time was taken the night after Joseph Magnasco's murder. A bunch of the Gallo crew were picked up on President Street and run in, and there's a photo of the lineup, with the dwarf Mondo's head coming no higher than the other guy's midsections. Cops asked Mondo if he saw the killer. "I saw his belt buckle," Mondo said. "Show me a lineup of belts and I might be able to recognize it." Because my mom and I were too close for comfort when Maggs was whacked, it was often the talk at my house. I learned that with Magnasco that day were my dad's friends Punchy and Cheetos. Punchy was Frank Punciliano, Mondo's first cousin and coiner of the name Snake. He was tough as nails, fought in the Golden Gloves when he was a kid, and hung out on President Street since day one. Later he used those hands to put a hurt on the Gallo's enemies. A lot of guys are called Punchy because they've been on the receiving end of too many punches, but this Punchy got the name for dishing them out, often in crisp and destructive combinations. He ran all of the street fairs in South Brooklyn, and finally became a made man in the 1970s. Punchy was close to my father, and they stayed close their whole lives. Cheetos was Gennaro Basciano, a real South Brooklyn tough guy, born and raised in the heart of Red Hook. He was a stone-cold killer, but you would never know it by speaking to him. He was right-hand man to Joey and Larry Gallo for many years. Like my dad, he could have earned a living in the ring. He had one-punch knockout power. He was quiet but deadly, and loyal. So those guys and Joey Maggs were driving up Union Street looking for Harry Fontana. They were looking for him because he was supposed to be on the Gallo side, but hadn't been doing as much as he could. In fact, it seemed like he was avoiding the Gallo crew, as if he might have something to hide. They found him in front of the Union Diner at the corner of Union and 4th Avenue. Maggs jumped out of the car and started arguing with Fontana. In the heat of the argument, Harry's bodyguard killed Maggs on the spot. My mom, being an adult when it happened, remembers it clearly. She became aware that there was some running around, some commotion nearby, a scuffle, car horns blaring, and gunshots. She grabbed me and started heading away from the action. She saw a couple of guys running away, just a glimpse out of the corner of her eye, so she couldn't say for sure who they were, not that she would have said anyway. "I'm smart enough not to look," she says. "None of my business." I was little, but I remember seeing Maggs yelling and then falling to the ground. I knew that these were friends of my father's, but I didn't realize until later that I had seen Maggs die there on the street. Even when I did figure it out, which was pretty quick, I was young and it didn't bother me very much. Later, while doing research for my first book, I found a photo that had been taken by a newspaper photographer of Joey still on the sidewalk, looking for all the world like he's taking a nap, a police chalk mark around him, and a priest, Father Benny Kaleha, administering the last rites. That's how I know the date, October 4, 1961. Later that month, the Gallos gained intelligence that the Olive Oil King was hiding out at his hunting lodge in the wilderness of New Jersey, so a crew went there to take care of business. They were met at the door by an aged caretaker who convinced them Joe Profaci wasn't there. Still in October, errant shots were fired by 2 gunmen, one of them being Cadillac Lou Mariani, at former Gallo business associate Jiggs Forlano outside Forlano's home in Astoria, Queens. The sound of bullets whizzing past his ears gave Jiggs pause, caused him to reconsider life's priorities. He left the Gallos and joined Profaci, eventually becoming a capo under Joe Colombo. At just before 3 a.m. on November 11, 1961, in a smoke-filled Brooklyn night spot called the Hi-Fi Lounge, gunfire erupted, sending an estimated 100 customers screaming into the street, while others cowered under tables. Police later had trouble finding 2 eyewitnesses who saw the same thing, but eventually concluded that 2 or 3 men had entered the joint and started firing guns. 42-year-old ex-con John Guerrilla and 27-year-old club owner Paul Ricci, a.k.a. Paul Rich, were dead. 31-year-old Thomas Riccardi also needed an ambulance for a bullet to the knee. FBI documents suggested that World War II vets Sal Mangiamelli and Michael Rizzatelli may have been the gunmen. Rizzatelli was originally a New York gun, but had been living in California for years before returning east to help out the war-torn Gallo crew. On November 22, cops raided 2 Sheepshead Bay apartments and confiscated an arsenal of weapons that, according to NYPD Assistant Chief Inspector Raymond V. Martin, were to have been used to finish off the Gallo gang. Martin said the war was being run on behalf of Joe Profaci by Sally, who was connected to at least one of the apartments and was free on $40,000 bail in connection with a cop shooting outside the Sahara Lounge. The other apartment at 2701 Ocean Avenue belonged to an attractive divorcee named Zoya Lenova. The weapons were 6 high-powered hunting rifles, 2 of them with telescopic sights, 2 shotguns, a sawed-off shotgun, a revolver, and ammunition for all of the guns. Also seized were $8,500 in clothes stolen from a freight warehouse in the city. The Gallos were facing 2 sorts of attrition during the first weeks of the war: guys getting shot and guys defecting to the other side because they could read the writing on the wall. Maybe you'd just seen the Billy Wilder picture, Some Like It Hot, which combines cross-dressing and gangsters, but on December 2, Carmine Persico decided that wearing drag would make a perfect disguise for a hit squad. And so it was that he and Sally D'Ambrosio, neither one of them very pretty, dressed up as women, climbed into a convertible sports car and hunted down Larry Gallo. Sally drove. Carmine sat shotgun with an actual shotgun across the lap of his dress. They found Larry, and Carmine managed to get off a shot but missed. Maybe his earrings got in the way. On December 11, 3 Gallo associates, including Larry Big Lollipop Carna, age 30, were fired upon 8 times from a drive-by car. Carna was wounded in the ankle, and a passerby was slightly injured. Carna was stepping out of a paint store along a busy Red Hook street when he was shot. The 2 men with him, Angelo Parfumi and Sal Mangiamelli, ran to their cars and fled. Police asked Big Lollipop who shot him. "I have nothing to say to you," Carna replied. In mid-December, Profaci declared a ceasefire. Assigned hits were canceled. Peace talks broke out. Charles Lo Cicero approached Larry Gallo with an offer of peace, and Larry told him he liked the idea of a ceasefire, but thought the undisclosed terms ridiculous. Profaci wanted subservience. The Gallos wanted Profaci to step down. On December 18, a pretty 22-year-old brunette named Palma Vitali was in court facing criminal contempt charges before Kings County Judge Hyman Barchet, based on her refusal to testify before a grand jury investigating gangland tumult. She was there because she was Sally's special friend, and her refusal to talk had Assistant DA Aaron Kuta calling for her to be jailed. But the judge gave her a suspended sentence and warned her to stop consorting with worthless characters. On her way out of the courtroom, Miss Vitali was handed a subpoena to testify before the next grand jury, a move that made her roll her eyes. On January 5, 1962, Carmine Persico, along with turncoat Jiggs Forlano and Dominic Donnie Shax Montemorano, went to the Copacabana. Donnie grew up less than a block from the Persicos on Carroll Street but was younger, born 1939, and didn't hang with the former Garfields until the President Street days. There they encountered a guy named Sidney Slater, who was behind on his loan payments. So taking care of business that had nothing to do with the Gallos, they beat the shit out of him, left him howling. Jiggs wore a newspaper hook on his ring finger, and Slater almost lost an eye. January 29, Michael and Philip Albergo, Gallo associates, came out of a restaurant and found their parked car with a flat. Upon closer inspection, they saw the tire had been ice-picked, so they were pretty pissed off as they started to put on the spare. As they squatted beside the car with jack and lug nut wrench in hand, a car drove by and shot them. The ceasefire was over. March 5, bullets flew in Joe Profaci's general direction, but he was unharmed. March 11, Carmine, Jiggs, and a couple of other Profaci capos sent out word that the old man was sick. Profaci was very ill, and it was time for him to step down. This might have sounded ungracious on Carmine's part, because the olive oil king had given him the big break that would make him a very rich man. But he was forgiven when it became obvious that he was not being disrespectful, but merely addressing an actual problem. Simultaneously, the Gallos, who were taking a licking in the ongoing war, went to the commission to ask that they handle the Gallo-Profaci dispute. Carlo Gambino advised Profaci of the Gallo's request, and meetings were held on the subject in Chicago and Detroit. Gambino and Tommy Lucchese asked Profaci nicely to step down. By this time, the papers, citing anonymous sources, were referring to Carmine Persico as Profaci's top gun, the man who held the contract to liquidate the remaining members of the Gallo gang, a guy who cruised the streets of South Brooklyn in a car full of guns, hunting gallows. Profaci guns, under Carmine's command, tended to shoot straighter than Gallo guns. Anthony Tony Fats Regina, in particular, had skills. He was considered a small arms expert and had been decorated for sharpshooting in Korea before he went AWOL. Interesting, in that President Street would be plagued by sniper fire. With the Profacis preoccupied with civil war, the other four families were growing increasingly concerned. Publicity over the death count was bad for business. All the squabbling over Profaci was moot, as Profaci died before the month was out, on June 6, 1962, of liver cancer. He was buried 5 days later in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, also the resting place of Lucky Luciano, and later of Joe Colombo and John Gotti. It was custom for a family to take some time to mourn when a boss died, before naming a new boss. But in this case, because of the war, Joseph Magliocco immediately and unofficially took over the family. He was never okayed by the commission, and his reign was brief. The Gallos had no voice in the decision, as they were not recognized as an entity by the commission. The Gallos were out, and if they wanted to get back in, they were going to have to apologize to the commission for their upstart behavior, and maybe, just maybe, they would be received back into the Profaci family. Now, while Carmine Persico was rapidly rising up the ranks, a shooting star gaining influence and power with each shake-up at the top, Magliocco was a guy who had been stuck in place for a long time. He had been with Joe Profaci when Profaci was given the 5th New York family, and had been Profaci's underboss for 34 long years. So when he was elevated to the top spot after all that time, he was a frustrated man, an ambitious man, who became suddenly power-hungry, not to mention the fact that he was still angry with the Gallos for kidnapping him and not allowing him to use a toilet when he needed to take a leak. So it's no surprise that one of Magliocco's first moves as boss was to order a skim of all gambling operations to go into a war fund, money earmarked solely for the destruction of the Gallos. In the meantime, no such fund existed on President Street, where morale was scraping bottom. Guys getting scared and bailing continued to be a problem. The first turncoats switched over to the Profaci side, but as that side lost some of its structural integrity during the exchange of power, others went to the Gambinos looking for a safe spot to work. In June 1962, the FBI filed a report saying the Gallo-Profaci war was hurting the numbers business. October 1962, two low-level guys who were friends of the Gallos, Anthony DiColo and Marco Morelli, simply disappeared. Poof. Reportedly hit by Carmine Persico and Jiggs Forlano. Carmine wanted the Gallos to know he would hit big men and little men, that he knew no distinction. There was a period of peace until Johnny Bath Beach Otto had his car engine torn up by gunfire while he sat behind the wheel in 1963. And that brings us to the most famous of all attempts on Carmine Persico's life. Chapter 8. Indestructible Carmine. Carmine, shot in the cheek, hand, and shoulder, got out of the vehicle, took several sideways steps, lurched forward, and collapsed to the sidewalk. There he spit out a bloody bullet. Loved dearly by his crime family, he was the man who could not be killed, and now he had a new nickname, the Immortal. In May 1963, Punchy shot and wounded Carmine Persico's bodyguard, the hard-to-miss Hugh McIntosh. Days later, a hit team from President Street, my dad, Rick DiMatteo, Punchy, and Cheetos, attempted to take out Carmine. And they did it in a surprisingly high-tech way. Rick, Punchy, and Pete the Greek Diapolis teamed up with Sal Mangiamelli, a Union president and former explosive ordnance specialist during World War II, who knew how to make a bomb and gave them instructions. Knowing those guys, they probably had a few drinks to steady their hands as they built the bomb. And it worked. My dad was among those who built the bomb, successfully placed it under Carmine's Cadillac, and detonated it with Carmine in the car. Just the fact that the bomb went off was considered a great success, with a lot of backslapping. but they didn't kill Carmine. Sure, the bomb exploded on cue under Carmine's Cadillac, and for that matter under Carmine as well. Fortunately for the intended victim, however, there was a steel plate under his seat, and he walked away with a concussion, permanent tinnitus, some cuts and bruises, and a sore ass. Back on President Street. Next time, let's just shoot him. Yeah, let's just fucking shoot him. They weren't satisfied with going hunting with pocket guns. A job like this demanded superior weaponry, so they brought with them an M1 carbine. If it was good enough for American soldiers in World War II, it was good enough for President Street. It was light, easy to use, semi-automatic, .30 caliber, and absolutely built to kill men. So on May 19, 1963, my dad, Pete the Greek, and Punchy tried to kill Carmine with bullets. Pete carried the rifle. The targets were Carmine and his longtime associate, 38-year-old Alphonse Funzi D'Ambrosio. The men were in an AMC Rambler at Bond and DeGraw Streets in Gowanus after leaving the home of Carmine's girlfriend and on their way to downtown Brooklyn for a court appearance when they were ambushed by the gunman in a panel truck. The shots neatly pierced the car's windshield. Carmine took hot lead to his cheek, left hand, and shoulder. He stumbled over to the sidewalk and spit out a bloody bullet. I've read that Carmine got up and drove himself to the hospital, but that's bullshit. He was down. Both wounded men were taken by ambulance to Kings County Hospital. As Carmine was being wheeled into the emergency treatment center, his face a crimson mask, a hole in his hand large enough to put a pool cue through, he was pestered by cops. "You got 5 bullets in you, Junior," an Irish plainclothes guy said, stride for stride with the guys pushing Carmine's gurney. "Look, you're gonna die any minute now. Before you go, why don't you straighten this thing out and tell us who did it? You know who it was. What's the difference if you talk now? You're gonna die." He didn't talk. For one thing, he'd just been shot in the mouth. But he also refused to talk. He shook his head at the annoying cop, who thankfully was left behind, as Carmine was transported into surgery. Even as his mouth healed, his lips remained sealed. Carmine was reported in poor condition, while Funzi was in good condition. Along with Junior and Snake, Carmine now picked up a new nickname, one he'd earned the hard way, the Immortal. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Such bullshit. Sometimes what doesn't kill you leaves you a drooling vegetable. This shooting did permanent damage to Carmine Persico. He never regained full use of his now twisted left hand. Of course, the cops knew who shot Carmine. They just wanted a witness to say it out loud. But they couldn't find one, so they rounded up 17 members of the Gallo crew, including Larry and Albert Gallo, and charged them all with illegal gun possession. Criminal Court Judge Lewis Wallach set bail ranging from $1,000 to $15,000. The low price tag went to blonde, 24-year-old Mrs. Paula Levatino, a crew member's curvaceous and accommodating girlfriend. Top price went to the least active of the brothers, Kid Blast Albert Gallo. The judge originally said his bail would be $10,000, but Albert talked back, saying like a smart aleck, "Thank you very much, Your Honor," at which point Wallach added $5,000 to his bail. Deputy Chief Inspector James K. Knott led the investigation. He said he was fairly certain that those responsible for the shooting were among those he'd rounded up. Figuring out which ones, of course, was a different matter. The President Street crew was mum. The day after the attempt on Carmine's life, it was announced that a special squad of veteran detectives had been assigned to keep their eyes on Red Hook gang activity around the clock, and they were known as PISA, the Police Investigating Suspected Assassins. The word assassin was esoteric at the time, but it went way mainstream that autumn in Dallas. Desperate for money to keep up the battle, the Gallos took contributions. One of their benefactors was a local businessman named Emil Colantuono. Recruiting other contributors, however, became difficult when Colantuono was the victim of a homicide on June 6, 1963. That same D-Day, they found the body of gun dealer and Gallo associate Alfred Mondello. Authorities suspected Mondello had been supplying arms to the Gallos. June 12, someone shot at Punchy. In the return fire, Vincent DiTucci was killed by Cheetos, who was arrested in connection with DiTucci's death, but later released for insufficient evidence. Some Profaci guys defected to the Gallo side. We don't know why. Maybe they, like the Gallows, were disgruntled over the excessive tribute money. Maybe they wanted to side with the guys with the biggest onions. Maybe they just preferred the underdog role. Such a man was 59-year-old Joseph Batts Cardiello, one of the brothers from the bar where Carmine whacked Frankie shots. Batts was once pro Face, now pro Gallo, and on August 9 was cut down in daylight by a volley of slugs in Brooklyn. Cardiello was shot 4 times from a high-powered black car as he sat in his own auto, waiting for a light to change. He was a good guy from the neighborhood. We could compile a short list of probable shooters, and Carmine Persico would be at the top. For one thing, Carmine's top guns were at that very moment out on Long Island. Only hours after Cardiello bought it, about 1:30 p.m., 50 miles to the east, Carmine's team, including 47-year-old John Moose Batista, a longshoreman who lived on Coney Island Avenue in Brooklyn, and 29-year-old Tony Fats Regina, the Long Island sharpshooter, were out on a hunt, driving along the Neconsett Highway near Port Jefferson, Long Island, with their target in sight. The subject of the hunt was Gallo crew member Cadillac Louis Mariani, 26, the boyfriend of my mom's friend Nancy. The gunman drove alongside Mariani's car and fired 12 shots. Also in the car was 26-year-old Anthony Getch and the 33-year-old Mrs. Dottie Vavavoom Vavino. 4 bullets had plowed into Getch's body, and he was taken to a Port Jefferson hospital where he fully recovered. Mrs. Vavino, in the excitement, forgot to say she'd seen and heard nothing, and instead blurted out to first responders that Fats was the one shooting, referring to Regina. Suffolk County Police subsequently put together a winning case against Regina and Batista. The trial was in Riverhead, Long Island, Suffolk County Judge George F.X. McInerney presiding. Cops kept Getch in hiding, and he became the star witness of the 4-week trial. From the witness stand, Getch said that Regina was driving the vehicle that pulled alongside the victim's car. Tony Fats Regina was also the shooter. Batista was one of 3 others in the shooting car. Getch said he knew who Regina was because he'd seen him cruise by in a car a few times while Getch was standing on the sidewalk in Brooklyn. Getch said he knew Batista because he'd seen him 10 to 15 times over a 2-year period. On cross-examination, Getch admitted that he'd never spoken to either of the defendants. The prosecution didn't call Mrs. Vavino to the stand, but the defense did. Under cross, she denied saying anything about Tony Fats after the shooting. She'd been hysterical. During summary, the Suffolk County DA made it plain. These 2 guys were assassins assigned to the Profaci top gun, Carmine Persico, Carmine the Snake Persico, the guy who held the contract to liquidate the Gallo gang. Following more than 2 days of deliberation, the jury convicted both defendants of murder 1, and Carmine Persico's army suffered a different kind of attrition, losing 2 gunmen to the law. Carmine's multiple legal troubles were put temporarily on hold each time he was wounded in an attack, but even when he was convalescing, the war went on without him. On July 24, 1963, Gallo crew member Ali Baba Hassan Wafa was shot to death in Hoboken, New Jersey. Wafa was 49 years old, a short and swarthy Egyptian, a guy that Joey Gallo met in prison, a seafaring cook, thief, and hashish smuggler. He'd been known to supply weapons to both grown-up and teenaged gang members. In 1955, he'd been prosecuted for piracy on the high seas. Legend had it that Ali Baba was murdered by Joe Yak and Sonny Pinto. That summer, Joe Magliocco plotted with Joe Bonanno to kill rivals Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino in an attempt to take over the commission. Magliocco made the mistake of ordering Joe Colombo to hit the 2 bosses, but instead Colombo told Gambino and Lucchese of Magliocco's plan. Magliocco somehow survived the sequence of events. On September 3, Magliocco was given an offer he couldn't refuse and retired. That is, he stepped down as Profaci's replacement. Joe Colombo became the boss and the war against the Gallows ended. The boss no longer held a grudge against the Gallows because of a kidnapping incident. The Gallows no longer hated the boss because of his excessive demands. It was time for peace. Magliocco, as it turned out, had a startlingly short retirement. He almost immediately had a heart attack and was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital Medical Center in West Islip, Long Island, where he died on December 28, 1963. Given that he was ousted after being caught scheming to kill other commission members, Magliocco's quick demise was considered highly suspicious, despite the fact that all outward appearances indicated natural causes. In 1969, an FBI wiretap picked up a New Jersey mob boss, Sam DiCavalcante, chit-chatting about Magliocco's death, saying in his humble opinion the commission had him hit with some sort of poison that wouldn't make itself obvious unless you went looking for it. The feds decided that they would go looking for it, exhumed Magliocco's body from its not-so-final resting spot in St. Charles Cemetery in Farmingdale, Long Island, and found no poison. In 1964, the name of the family was changed to the Colombo family. The death toll in the Civil War, according to FBI figures which may be low, was 9 dead, 3 missing and presumed dead, 11 injured, and 9 fired at but missed. The FBI didn't know all of it, though. Some wounds were treated by mob doctors, bite the belt, and never became public. It was in 1964 that Carmine Persico and the word kingpin first appeared together in a daily newspaper. During the wee morning hours of October 27, 1964, squads of detectives rousted as many bookies as they could find from their beds and hauled them, 35 of them, to Brooklyn's anti-racketeering headquarters. 12 more were being sought. According to DA Aaron J. Kuta, the prize among those captured was gambling kingpin Carmine Persico. Kuta said Carmine was the overlord of the operation, which brought in upward of $35,000 a day. Kuta said that his investigation had bared a conspiracy between the hoods, the cops, and employees of the New York Telephone Company. One of the prime movers in the conspiracy was, Kuta said, William J. Hussey, a 58-year-old former chief of the security division of the phone company. Despite Kuta's proclamations, Carmine was back on the street without missing a shave. With Colombo secure as boss, Carmine moved up yet another notch. One of Colombo's first executive orders was to promote Carmine to capo regime. Carmine and the boss could regularly be seen in conference, their heads together, no one else privy to the topic. Colombo was respected but not popular. No one said anything nice about him. Carmine, on the other hand, was the popular choice, the competent, street-savvy leader they wanted to take orders from. Persico had that tough guy reputation. He was the way they liked to envision themselves. He scared the shit out of people, a power that often benefited those who worked under him. Guy gets behind in his payments, say. You don't want, I should tell Junior. Guy pays up like that. Worked just like crazy Joey's lion. Carmine was the incredible learner, chilly, cold killer, creator of plans that worked, former legendary teen phenom, and made man at an age when others were still running errands. A fucking legend. Carmine was the real deal, a hood's hood. One of Carmine's top hitmen during the Gala War was Dominic Little Dom Cataldo, whose chiseled features made the ladies swoon. He dressed as if valeted by Damon Runyon, straight out of Guys and Dolls. Cataldo eventually married Albert Anastasia's niece. A housewife from Kansas could have taken one look at him and ID'd him as a New York gangster. He made his bones taking contracts from Carmine Persico at the expense of the President Street boys. Still, Cataldo remained unmade because of the moratorium on new buttons. Cataldo had an uncle who ran casinos in Havana until Castro came, and a tough grandmother, former bootlegger Ervolino Cataldo, who by the 1960s was using her East New York house as a front for a horse and sports book. Little Dom used his well-dressed tough guy image to loan shark at the track. His image was such that violence was often not necessary. Just an insincere smile and a poke in the chest did the trick. No one wanted he should tell Junior. Dominic finally got his button after Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, when the books were opened. Technically, you weren't supposed to be bumping guys off without permission, and you weren't supposed to be dealing drugs. But Cataldo had been doing both for years, and now he had a button himself. He was also in on the 1980 hit on Gerard Papa, who had connections with both the Colombo and Genovese families. Cataldo had his own restaurant, a place called Villaggio Italia, where he reputedly whacked guys in the back room, put them in the trunk of his car, and, according to Sal Polisi, dumped them upstate off the Taconic Parkway. Like many hoods of the era, Cataldo worked himself into a nice coke habit in the 1980s, and his resulting paranoia led to ever-increasing amounts of bloodshed. Cataldo was convicted in the Pizza Connection case in 1987 of smuggling more than $1 billion in heroin over the previous decade. He died of natural causes in prison 10 years later. The government learned much about the Commission's existence in 1962 through their ace informant. Only many years later would the source be revealed as Gregory Scarpa, a guy who ostensibly worked only for Carmine Persico. It was not unheard of for the government to use hoodlums in unexpected ways. Mob guys came in very handy for U.S. intelligence services during World War II, offering up their knowledge of Sicilian and Italian geography before Allied invasions there. There was cooperation between feds and hoods over Cuba after Castro took over and kicked the mob out. The mantra was, "Just because I'm a hood, don't mean I ain't a patriot." The source said that the commissioners were the heads of the families and considered of equal rank. There were 5 in New York and 1 each in Florida, Arizona, Nevada, California, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Boston, and Chicago. When a problem arose that the commission needed to rule on, there was a team of 2 or 3 men who went around the country and contacted the commissioners with the where and when of the meeting. The commissioners, or, after Appalachian, a panel that they appointed, would listen to both sides of the beef, like the Supreme Court, and the ruling was binding throughout what was essentially a national crime organization. Scarpa said that the former Profaci family had about 400 members, made guys. Of the 5 NYC families, he said, the Gambinos were the most populous, with a membership of about 1,000. He said that when the head of one of the families died or was imprisoned, the commission would recommend a replacement, who would serve as a member of the commission. If a commissioner got out of prison, they would resume their position on the commission, and their replacement would step down. Colombo thought all of this La Cosa Nostra business, everyone quoting Valachi, was out of control. Too many headlines, too much star status. Business was best done without a light shining on it. Their cover story needed freshening and brightening, and this was the sort of thing he was good at. He formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League, a loudmouth group whose job was to convince the world that La Cosa Nostra was a figment of Valachi's imagination, that all of those mafioso he described were actually legitimate businessmen, trying to get their piece of the pie, trying to live the American dream. The IACRL's chaplain was Father Louis Gigante, brother of Vincent the Chin. During the summer of 1965, there came to light an audio tape of a police detective, James Daly, and Francis J. Farrell, an agent for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, trying to force an ex-con to shake down Carmine Persico. The recording was made from a phone booth not far from the Journal-American newspaper office building in Manhattan. The tape made headlines largely because it had ghoulish appeal. The ex-con, Joseph Cadlop, was already dead by the time the tape played. Papers got to talk about a voice from the grave through the miracle of Memorex. On July 31, 1965, Cadlop was killed by a cop after he killed a brother officer in a wild shoot-'em-up in a Bay Ridge, Brooklyn tavern. The detective and agent were under investigation by a grand jury for the plot. The tape was made by Cadlop for 2 newspapermen from the Journal-American, it was reported. The plot, it was explained, was to collect $2,000 a month from Carmine Persico. To earn this, they would threaten him with a false drug arrest. Carmine, the theory went, wouldn't fear being arrested, but being associated with drugs would be defaming. He'd pay, they figured. Cadlop approached the reporters on July 27, 1965, a vulnerable 3-time loser. One more conviction meant life. He told the reporters, "That's what the cops and the feds are holding over my head. I'm caught in the middle." Cadlop told the newspaper that he'd gone as far as to make a date to meet Carmine, but was frightened off, suspecting he'd been double-crossed by Farrell and Daly. When Cadlop first spoke to the reporters, he told them, "I'm going to be hit by a cop or a fed. Believe me, I know what I'm talking about." To protect Cadlop, Dom Fresca, city editor at the paper, gave Cadlop a note addressed to the fed and the cop saying, "This is to let you know I have tapes, which are going to be used if anything happens to Joseph Cadlop." The note was found in Cadlop's home after his death, reported DA Aaron E. Kuta. Kuta later explained that there was no connection between the tapes and Cadlop's death. Despite the fact that the targets of the DA's investigation were members of law enforcement, Kuta said, "I concluded that the matter was of the greatest importance to law enforcement and required a thorough investigation before a grand jury, where all the facts and circumstances could be fully and completely explored. As of now, I have formed no definite opinion as to whether the detective and the narcotics agent were engaged in some form of skullduggery or criminal conduct. Both the Fed and the cop denied the charges. Farrell told his supervisor, according to the New York Times, that he had just been joking along with the ex-con. Their defense was predictable. Look at the accuser. He was diagnosed as a psychopath. He'd done a long stretch in that hellhole in Dannemora, and he died a cop killer. Who are you going to believe? The 1960s was Carmine Persico's best decade. He had dough, power, and a healthy sex drive. Just as in the 1950s, he went to jail periodically but was always granted quick release. He lived the life of a well-to-do hood, part most wanted, part celebrity. On any given night, Carmine and his friends could be seen sitting facing the door in one of his 3 favorite Brooklyn restaurants, either New Corners or Romano's in Bensonhurst or the Amber Steakhouse at 100th Street and 3rd Avenue near Fort Hamilton. Sometimes he hung out in the old neighborhood at his cousin Mush's club on Sackett Street between 3rd and 4th Avenues. Junior and Mush dated starlets. According to reports, Carmine went out with Goldie Hawn on his arm, who at the time was a barely legal dancer looking for a break in showbiz. Mush dated Lainey Kazan, a graduate of Hofstra University Drama School and then veteran of one episode of the TV comedy Car 54, Where Are You? In 1966, Goldie and Lainey were complete babes. Lainey was in Penthouse. Beautiful women of all occupations were drawn to top organized crime figures. There was the money, sure, but there was the danger, too. It's been known to get women worked up. Hawn, of course, went on to bigger and better things. First as a breakout star of the revolutionary TV show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, parlaying that fame into a movie career that won her an Oscar for her role in Cactus Flower. She has never commented on her experiences with Carmine. That would be indiscreet, as he was and is a married man. Lainey Kazan went on to have a successful singing and acting career and returned to the limelight in the more recent past as the mom in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Carmine was in with the in-crowd. He hung out in hip night spots, like the dark and narrow Bachelor 3, the super-swinging joint owned in part by New York Jets quarterback and future Super Bowl hero Joe Namath. Carmine wasn't the only mobster who held court at Bachelor's 3. Police surveillance, both human and electronic, had determined that hoods were both hanging out and doing business in Joe's place. There was evidence of one meeting in the back, in the dark, that included 13 undesirables, 11 of whom were involved in the rackets. The connection between Broadway Joe and mob stuff dated back to 1966, not long after the Pennsylvania-born Namath graduated from the University of Alabama and came to New York to play for the Jets. As a rookie still wet behind the ears, Joe was alleged to have had meetings with gangsters about co-owning nightclubs in Manhattan. By 1969, the situation became so notorious that Pete Rozelle, the longtime commissioner of football, ordered Namath to give up his 50% share in the nightclub or face suspension. Namath showed nads of steel and told the commissioner to go fuck himself and announced his retirement from football. It was the NFL that backed down. Namath eventually sold the bar, but only after Jets coach Weeb Ewbank asked him to. In Carmine's crew during the late 1960s was Sammy the Bull Gravano, who later switched to the Gambinos and became a well-known hitman. One day Carmine summoned Gravano and told him to give a beating to a Long Island washing machine distributor who was having an affair with the wife of one of his brothers. Carmine's parting words were, "Bring me back his ear." Gravano later said he didn't intend to cut off the man's ear, but while he was administering the beating with a blackjack, he accidentally severed the guy's pinky finger, so he brought that back with him. Carmine was pleased. It was a gruesome act that reportedly earned the Bull kudos from Joe Colombo himself. One of the primary reasons for the 1960s being great was the cops, who were often dirty. It wasn't until Frank Serpico's undercover work that the extent of NYPD corruption became known. One plainclothes unit in Brooklyn had to be entirely revamped when it was revealed that it, as an entity, was on the take. In 1969, the Knapp Commission was formed. Of course, there would always be dirty cops, but throwing on a light made the roaches scatter. In 1968, Larry Gallo, my dad's good friend, the guy who bore the mark of the snake on his neck, died of natural causes. With Larry gone, Kid Blast had to step up, while Crazy Joe tried to run things from prison. In 1969, Carmine was out on $15,000 bail regarding the ever-ongoing hijacking charges, and burning the candle at both ends. Despite Carmine's legal nightmare when it came to his hijacking bust, hijacking continued to be popular, often in mixed family crews. On April 10, 1967, when a team, including Henry Hill of Goodfellas fame, stole almost $500,000 in Air France cargo, Colombo capo Buster Alloy received $50,000 in tribute, which he distributed appropriately. By the time Carmine Persico was in his mid-30s, he had moved his family out of Brooklyn, and, like many thousands of other Brooklynite businessmen, to the suburbs of Long Island. He lived on Sunset Drive in Hempstead, just off the Hempstead Turnpike, only a few miles east of the Belmont Park racetrack. It was a beautiful two-story home, with a finished attic and basement and a sweet screened-in porch on one side. Step out the front door and you were looking at the Hempstead Golf and Country Club. Built in 1930, it was not a show-off house by any means, not like those fortresses along Shore Road and Bay Ridge. This was home sweet home, 2.5 bathrooms. His home life conditions improved, but the rest of his life kept the same old scenery. His headquarters were at the Diplomat Social Club at the dingy corner of Carroll and 3rd Avenue, only a couple of blocks from where Steve Bove was murdered, just around the corner from Mush's club. And he hung out with the same guys all the time, the guys he trusted, his crew. Humongous Hugh Apples McIntosh was always at Carmine's side. Jerry Lang was always there, Sonny Franzise's brother, Carmine, maniac Greg Scarpa, and when he got out of prison for the Steve Bove murder, Carmine's brother Alphonse. Also hanging around was a stone-faced kid named Tony Sirico. He was a half-generation younger, born in the 40s, and could be very scary when he wanted to be. He was arrested 28 times while working in Carmine's crew. But it all ended up looking surprisingly good on his resume when he was cast as Tony Stacks in the movie Goodfellas, and went on to play Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. In 1970, Joe Colombo's son was busted by the feds on a conspiracy charge. Former Profaci underboss Sal Musacchio, one of the guys kidnapped by the gallows, and Capo Sebastian Buster Alloy were busted in Nassau County on Long Island for gambling. In response, Joe transformed his activist Italian-American Civil Rights League into an anti-FBI group. The initial group consisted of the Colombo family and about 30 friends, but it grew. For 2 months during the spring, the organization picketed FBI headquarters in New York every night. The harassment of the FBI was steady but weak. Colombo wanted to up the ante, so he planned a major event, the sort of thing that would bring him national, perhaps even global publicity, maybe initiate a congressional investigation. On June 29, 1970, there was to be a massive rally at Columbus Circle, at the southwest corner of Central Park in Manhattan. The IACR and its supporters were scheduled to march in FBI headquarters. Some of Colombo's activists prepared signs to be handed out that read, "More power to Italians." To appreciate what Colombo was doing, you had to know the climate of the country, which was very protest-oriented. Students were protesting the Vietnam War. Black people protested they weren't treated fairly. So Colombo decided to be hip. His complaint? Italians were being persecuted in this country. Our civil rights were being violated. Colombo shouted it for all to hear. Not everyone bought in. Truth was, there were hoods who didn't like the scam. It wasn't becoming. Bad optics, they'd call it today. Some hoods, such as those on President Street, didn't want to go to the rally. We went. The Gallo crew, and me, a 6-foot teenager. We were told it would be disrespectful to not be there. Hoods were tepid at best when it came to the movement. Colombo's slogans resonated big time with Italians in the legit world, tired of being thought of as mobsters just because their names ended in a vowel. Everyone had their own take on Colombo's unusually bold form of hypocrisy. It was called the Italian Pride Rally, and attendance surpassed Colombo's largest dreams. The crowd grew until it stopped traffic on the west side. The entertainment was out of this world. Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr. rat-packed their way through a set. Jimmy Durante played piano and told jokes. Colombo's tub thumpers said there were 650,000 people there. Cops said 40,000. My estimate was in between, about 100,000 people. More than 500 charter buses delivered Italians to the city, coming from as far away as Florida. Some of the piers were shut down because of absent longshoremen. In Italian neighborhoods, shops were closed. It was a holiday, a big party. At the rally, someone handed out little American and Italian flags, so everyone was waving something. The previous summer, 300,000 kids gathered on a farm in upstate New York for 3 days of rock and roll and anti-Vietnam chanting, so the Columbus Circle rally was dubbed in the tabloids as Italian Woodstock. "Come on, FBI, stop harassing the Italians," that was the rallying cry. A stream of speakers assailed the practice of equating Italians with criminals. Joe Colombo was in charge, of course, but the real energy behind the movement was his son Anthony, VP of the IACRL Ad Hoc Committee. When Anthony took the podium, the band played for He's a Jolly Good Fellow. Goodfellas wasn't yet a movie title back then, and only a few got the joke. "Are we one? Are we united today?" Anthony asked. Most of the crowd cheered enthusiastically, but others did not. Carmine and other old-fashioned gangsters thought it was too much. To be facing prison, an appeal for sympathy from those who weren't in the life was downright castrating. Joe Sr. spoke last, at first disregarding the self-serving nature of the protest. After all, this entire event was about Joe's son not going to jail. The crowd gave Joe an enthusiastic hand. He told the gathering that he was just a real estate salesman. Why should his family be subject to federal investigation? Enthusiasm waned as Joe's hypocrisy went from implied to in-your-face. When festivities were over, only about 1 out of 10 at the rally stayed for the march in FBI headquarters. 2 cops on crowd control duty at FBI HQ were stabbed with ice picks, but there were no arrests. Both cops were taken to the hospital with non-life-threatening wounds. Blowback was harsh. Some journalists weren't afraid to call Joe Colombo out. He was the boss of a crime family, after all, the very guy who most made all of those innocent Italian-Americans look bad. The FBI, the paper said, was not trying to persecute Italians, but was rather intent on getting killers off the streets. Karma was instant. The day after the rally, Joe was arrested and indicted, along with 24 others, by Nassau County DA William Kahn, and charged with criminal contempt for refusing to answer grand jury questions about organized crime. Colombo pleaded not guilty and paid his $5,000 bail. Predictably, the IACRL sent about 100 protesters out to the Long Island courthouse, where Colombo's hearing took place. Signs referred to the DA as a stoolie for the FBI. Colombo denied refusing to answer questions. If he seemed evasive, it was because he wasn't feeling well and may not have communicated well. Kahn called Colombo the head of a Mafia crime family. Colombo said Kahn was going to have to prove that. "If there's anything we can do to help Mr. Kahn fight crime, we want to do it," Colombo said. Carmine Persico must have felt like he was going to puke. Mr. Profaci had maintained that he was a legit businessman as well, olive oil, but he didn't go around rubbing people's noses in it. Some newspapers, astoundingly, printed Colombo's Dyker Heights, Brooklyn address. A year later, as the anniversary of Italian Woodstock approached, Joe Colombo made plans to hold the second annual. But things had changed by then. I know the boys in the Gallo crew were told not to go to the 1971 Italian-American Civil Rights League rally, again to be held at Columbus Circle, because that would have been construed as showing support for Joe Colombo, which by this time the crew did not want to do. Support for Colombo had degraded from begrudging to non-existent. The crew had gone to the first one but didn't like it and left early. The League scored a major victory in November 1970 when they held a benefit at Madison Square Garden and Sinatra again showed up to sing. By this time, though, it wasn't just the Gallo crew that wanted to steer clear of Colombo's party. Carlo Gambino ordered all of his people to stay away as well. So both the crowd and the energy level was down at Italian Woodstock 2, June 28, 1971. Colombo's activism had been interrupted as of late by African-American agitators. Guys from the ghetto, Nation of Islam guys with sharp black suits and skinny ties but no dough, were wondering out loud just what the fuck this millionaire was talking about. Colombo assumed the pushback from blacks was Joey Gallo's work. Crazy Joey was getting the brothers agitated. Columbo had heard that Joey had, counterintuitively, gotten tight with some of the inmates from Bed-Stuy while in prison. Now this Gallo crew doctrine, don't go to the rally, became very important, because things did not go well for Joe Columbo that day. As he was on his way to the podium to give his speech, a mini-skirted black woman with a large Angela Davis-style afro flirtatiously said hey. Columbo's face twisted languorously into a wolfish grin. The guy escorting the woman, a press-credentialed filmmaker toting an expensive camera, in actuality Harlem hustler Jerome Johnson, took advantage of a stationary target, pulled an automatic, and fired 3 shots into Joe Columbo's head. Columbo's kid and a bodyguard wrestled Johnson to the ground, at which point another man stepped forward and shot Johnson to death. The second shooter escaped. His identity, as well as that of the flirtatious woman, remained forever unknown. Officially, anyway. Only moments after the shootings, a reporter found Columbo's son Anthony, who was already processing Dad's shooting in an historical context. It was a nut, the same kind of a nut who killed President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, Anthony said. As police tried to secure the area, which had turned into a wild scene, people running and screaming and falling and being trampled upon, Columbo, blood pouring from his mouth down onto his shirt, was loaded onto a gurney and rushed by ambulance to Roosevelt Hospital, where a team of 3 brain surgeons battled for hours to remove bullets and fragments from his gray matter. Afterward, one surgeon said that Columbo remained close to death. He described a blood clot in Columbo's brain that had burst like a boil during the operation. Eventually, doctors said he was probably going to live, but Columbo was brain dead. Back at Columbus Circle, there was a half-hearted attempt to continue the show, but just about everyone split after the shooting. Columbo didn't die, not technically and not right away. As Joey Gallo liked to say, Columbo got vegetabled. At the 54th Street police station, Kid Blast and Joey Gallo, who admittedly had a reputation for questioning authority, were among the first to be questioned by investigators. Joey was adamant. It was not me. Someone tried to make it look like it was me, but it was not. Joey explained that he wasn't a major fan of Columbo's style, but his beef was with the previous administration. Investigators tended to believe him, but not everyone did. Joey made friends with black men in prison. Black guy bumped Columbo. Some city authorities were avoiding the question of culpability by going to the Warren Commission playbook. Daniel P. Holman of the NYC Joint Strike Force to Combat Organized Crime said he didn't think rival mob families were behind the shooting, that Jerome A. Johnson was, like Lee Harvey Oswald and Sirhan, referenced by Anthony Columbo minutes after the shooting before him, a lone nut, a psychopath, who acted alone for reasons unknown. Holman said he'd studied Johnson's background and came to the conclusion that no one would ever have hired Johnson as a pro-killer. The NYPD didn't leap on the lone nut bandwagon. They knew better. Johnson might have been a psycho, Chief of Detectives Albert A. Seidman said, but that didn't mean someone didn't hire him. Sal Polizzi, an insider, has pondered the question. He's asked himself who gained the most, and he thinks it was Carmine Persico and Carlo Gambino that had Columbo vegetabled. The boss didn't die until May 22, 1978. Polizzi backed up his theory by pointing out that following the Columbo shooting, the Columbo and Gambino families displayed a downright cooperative relationship, including joint endeavors, which would have been out of the question when Joe Columbo was animate. Of course, the Columbos were not known for their ability to read between the lines. They reacted spontaneously and blamed Joey Gallo and his crew. There was more violence on the horizon, and again, Carmine Persico moved up a rung on the ladder of power. With the boss incapacitated, underboss Joseph Iacovelli and Tommy DeBella technically took control of the Columbos. But in reality, the Persico family overwhelmed Iacovelli and DeBella at that point. Iacovelli, it was noted by insiders, did not have a crew of his own, but had allied himself with Carmine Persico's crew. There was no insubordination involved. Iac was smart enough to let Carmine do his thing. Carmine would have been an almost automatic choice as the new boss if it wasn't for the hijacking beef that wouldn't go away. The boys didn't want a new boss who was going to go away any day for a decade or more. Or did they? Maybe having a boss in stir was workable. In 1971, there were indications that Carmine, undeterred by the tightening perimeter of justice around him, had upped the earning ante, diversifying from the usual mob rackets into the world of WASP white-collar crime. We know this because of statements made that July by 40-year-old Edward H. Wenish, a government informant with immunity testifying before the Senate Investigation Subcommittee. Wenish said that he handled $50 million in stolen stocks and bonds and was involved with certain mobsters in the counterfeit security racket. He listed many names of mobsters he'd had dealings with, and one of them was Carmine Persico, Jr. Some of the fraudulent transactions were made with the sheikdom of Kuwait. Now that is the white-collar crime big time. Machiavelli was a short, stocky man, with slicked-back black hair, a bachelor, rare in mob circles, and known as an expert winemaker. He was hauled in front of a grand jury in September 1971 and asked questions about organized crime's influence on New York City's legitimate businesses. He refused to answer. Newspapers noted that, like Carmine Persico, Machiavelli was moving up the Colombo ranks like a hit single, going from soldier to capo to consigliere in quick order. Yak was acting boss with Colombo in a coma. The older men of the mob, the traditionalists, thought 67-year-old Frank Fusco, who had run gambling operations in Brooklyn forever, would make an excellent choice to replace Colombo. But they were behind the times. The family was filled with strong and youthful up-and-comers. A 67-year-old man was not going to lead. The other pretenders to the throne were Joe Colombo's kids, Anthony and Joe Jr., known as Jojo. They, as princes, thought they were destined to be kings. In the mid-1970s, FBI informant Joe Cantalupo, a Colombo guy, reported that Joe Colombo's sons had tried a coup but failed. The Colombo brothers had plenty of juice when the old man was in charge. Now, not so much. The wheel has turned, Cantalupo said. The Colombo boys are on the bottom and the Persicos are on top. How big was Carmine Persico's domain? What was the scope of his power? Investigators wanted to know. Cantalupo said Carmine's wealth and influence was now tremendous, the scope broad. The Colombo crime family, with Carmine in charge, was taking protection money from every business in Bensonhurst, as well as other Brooklyn neighborhoods, a vast region. The protection racket worked, just as it had in the old days, with raw intimidation and terror. They put the fear into a guy and then they shake him down, Cantalupo explained. And the government knew it. So even though Joe Yak was technically the acting boss, for all practical purposes, Carmine took charge of the Colombo family in 1972 at the youthful age of 39. The official switch probably occurred sometime in 1973. America's relationship with the mob, along with the mob's vision of itself, changed drastically in 1972 with the release of Francis Ford Coppola's masterpiece, The Godfather. That movie cast a deep spell over America and the world. It was a wildly romantic vision and an incredible artistic achievement, just maybe the greatest movie ever made. It presented the American Mafia the way people wanted it to be. Hell, it presented the mob the way mobsters wanted it to be. Everyone loved the movie, even though some of the inside guys said its notions were imaginative. I can't see an American kissing another American's ring, no matter how Italian they are, one hood close to Carmine Persico commented, but added that the music was the best he'd ever heard. On the impressionable, the movie had a startling effect. There was now a new crop of hoods and hood wannabes that dreamt one day of living just like those guys in the movie, but most of them never did. The film presented a world of familial dynasties in which bloodline was king, instead of money being king, which is the way it was in real life. During production of The Godfather, and after its release, there was interaction between the movie's players and real gangsters like Carmine Persico. The actors were drooling to get some inside tips on playing real-life gangsters, and it was Carmine Persico who said if the Hollywood boys wanted to learn about the life, they were free to hang out with him and his crew. According to Eric Pooley, writing in New York Magazine in 1992, Carmine was a technical advisor on the movie and had allowed the actors, James Caan in particular, to hang around with him to soak up real mob color. Coppola had no more than called action for the first shot when Joseph Colombo himself and a small crew, one of them as big as a house, visited the set and told the director, along with producer Albert Ruddy, that the word Mafia was not to appear in the movie, the Cosa Nostra either, Why not? Coppola asked. It is demeaning to Italians and Italian Americans, Columbo said. And so those words were deleted from the script, but... Okay, Coppola said, but I want him in my picture. The director pointed at the middle of the chest of the Man Mountain standing over Columbo's shoulder. Columbo nodded and turned to leave. Lenny talked to the man. He wants to make you a star, Columbo said, unaware that he'd never have a chance to see the picture. The man was Lenny Montana, and he played Luca Brasi in the movie. Truth was, Montana, all 6'6", 390 of him, had some showbiz experience. In fact, Montana was a stage name of sorts. He'd been born Lenny Pasifato in Brooklyn in 1926. He'd been in the pro wrestling biz. Starting in 1953, he'd worked under many names. Lenny the Bull Montana, Chief Chickawicki, Zebra Kid, Mighty Seco. He once won the NWA World Tag Team belts with Hard-Boiled Haggerty. Things went bad in 1960 when Montana broke a leg in a match against Vern Gaffney. After that, he went to work for Mr. Columbo. Not just his muscle, either. He was an innovative arsonist, too. He used to tie kerosene-soaked tampons to the tails of mice, light 'em up, and release 'em into a structure. So Hollywood and South Brooklyn broke bread. The relationship was not always a smooth one, mostly because Khan could be an asshole. He thought he was funny, but someone could have gotten hurt. After one uncomfortable interaction with Carmine, Giovanni Russo, the actor who played Carlo Rizzi in the movie, the real-life godson of Frank Costello, came to hate Khan and could never again be in the same room with him. During the second week of filming, Rizzi said, sometime in the summer of 1971, before Carmine went away for hijacking, but after the attempted assassination of Joe Colombo, cast members were having drinks at Gillies, a West Side tavern known for being Frank Sinatra's favorite. Khan, ever the smug prankster, told Russo that Carmine Persico was in the back room with his daughter, that he should go back and pay his respects. So Russo went back to see Carmine, and sure enough, there he was with a beautiful woman. Russo said, "Your daughter is gorgeous. What a beautiful girl." Carmine's face dropped. It wasn't his daughter. It was a broad he was with, and Khan had purposely lied to Russo. Some of the boys at Carmine's table got up to teach this idiot a lesson, but Tommy Bilotti stepped in. Honest mistake, honest mistake. The woman is beautiful. So Russo didn't get a beating, but he has hated Khan's guts ever since. Bilotti was best man at Russo's wedding, but his peacekeeping days ended on December 16, 1985, when he came down with a serious case of lead poisoning outside Spark Steakhouse in the same hit that killed Big Paul Castellano. Despite that one faux pas, Carmine and the film people got along. Khan and Andy Mush Russo became lifelong friends. Carmine allowed Coppola access to genuine locations that lent the film supreme authenticity. There are solid indications that Carmine shared some of his favorite stories with the Hollywood boys. In The Godfather Part 2, which came out in 1974, there's a scene in which the character Pantageli is being garroted in a dark and empty bar when the murder is interrupted by a cop on the beat, a clear reference to the attempted murder of Larry Gallo in the Sahara Lounge. The feds didn't give up on Carmine just because he was facing serious hijacking time. They knew he was a killer, and went after him harder than ever. On November 11, 1971, Carmine went on trial for 37 counts of usury, coercion, extortion, and conspiracy. The charges, in a nutshell, were that Carmine had been running a loan-sharking business out of a Manhattan fur shop. As was often true in cases with multi-indictments, there was a lot of repetition from charge to charge, and before the trial, Judge Postel trimmed the indictment down to 10 counts. During the trial's first day, with the jury outside the courtroom, Justice George Postel of the New York State Supreme Court began to act strangely. By this time, Carmine knew more than the average Joe about courtroom machinations. There was something about the judge's tone, his mannerisms, his body language that made Carmine feel good inside. The judge, with just a touch of paranoid fervor, warned the reporters in attendance that they were to confine their accounts to the indictment and the testimony, and to eliminate any descriptions of the defendant's background, which might serve to bias the jury. "I don't want anything in the papers that doesn't come out of this courtroom. If you repeat it tomorrow, you'll be in the can," His Honor exclaimed. In particular, the judge objected to usage in print of Carmine's nickname, the Snake, mention of his designation by the feds as a member of organized crime, or the word hijacking. Judge Postel's pronouncements were in response to Carmine's defense attorney, Maurice Edelbaum, who asked for a mistrial based on news stories that ran in the New York Times and Daily News describing Carmine's past as a criminal and member of organized crime. The judge ceremoniously polled the jury, and each said they hadn't read the articles. Judge Postel denied the notion for a mistrial. For purposes of the record, prosecutor Samuel A. Yasgur asked the judge upon which law he was basing his ruling. Judge Postel replied, Postel's law, and informed the press of the new ground rules. The incident caused the managing editor of the Times, A.M. Rosenthal, to issue a statement saying that the paper was sensitive to fair trial issues, yet believed under the First Amendment that the decision as to what to print must rest with the newspaper in accordance with responsible journalistic standards. As the trial proceeded and public interest grew, Carmine's notoriety approached superstar status. Judge Postel, in response, took further steps to prevent his courtroom from being contaminated by Persico fever. Counsel on both sides were forbidden to make statements to the press. The court transcripts, legally the possession of the court stenographer, were by the judge's order sealed until the jury verdict was in. He eventually barred the public and newsmen from the trial. 5 reporters, Richard Oliver of the Daily News, David Burnham of the Times, Jack Robbins of the Post, Howard Reeser of the Long Island Press, and Edward McCarthy from UPI, tried to sit in the courtroom in defiance of the ruling, and the judge promptly had them removed. Reporters and photographers began peeking through the windows in the courtroom's outer doors, so Judge Postel had green blotters placed over the windows. The public trial would go on, in essence, privately. That privacy was most controversial. The Sixth Amendment provides that a defendant shall have the right to a public trial. The counter to this was that, although this might be true, the removal of the public and press was done because of complaints by the defendant and his defense team that he could only get a fair shake if the trial was held in private. So Carmine Persico had in essence waived his right to a public trial. To this, members of the press argued that the right to a public trial was not at the discretion of the accused alone. The right of the people to know was also to be considered. A public trial is necessary in all cases, the press argued, because a trial held in camera, that is, outside the public view, always, justifiably or not, gave rise to suspicions that the proceedings weren't on the up and up. The press, after all, was not at trials just to inform the public, but also as a guard against miscarriages of justice. It was that role that was being denied by Judge Postel. All of the fuss about who was and wasn't supposed to be in the courtroom proved to be beside the point. The defense really had nothing to worry about, as the prosecution's case fell apart regardless of the fact that no one was watching. First of all, one of the prosecution's witnesses vanished just before he was supposed to take the stand. This, purposefully or not, served as a message to the others scheduled to testify against Carmine. The prosecution's key witness, Mrs. Sylvia Winograd, was supposed to implicate Carmine in a loan sharking operation. Although she endured 6 grueling days on the stand, she somehow failed to ever incriminate Carmine Persico. Judge Postel overruled prosecution objections and promised Winograd that, in exchange for her truthful testimony, not only would her guilty plea for loan sharking be wiped out, but her amnesty would include a guilty plea in another case involving possession of stolen furs. Mrs. Winograd and her husband Joseph owned a fur shop and had pleaded guilty to 37 counts of possession of stolen goods. They were scheduled to be sentenced in December. Before Mrs. Winograd's testimony, Prosecutor Yasgur asked that she be considered a hostile witness, a designation that allowed the prosecutor to ask leading questions. The judge refused to do so, but finally relented several days into Mrs. Winograd's testimony. During her testimony, Mrs. Winograd said that she had known the defendant for 7 to 10 years. She and her husband knew him as Junior. Yasgur played for the jury a recording of a 1968 wiretap, a phone conversation between Mrs. Winograd and Samuel Lesner, a 4th defendant in this case, that had disappeared. Mrs. Winograd admitted that it sounded very much like her voice on the tape. She admitted that Lesner worked with her in a loan shark operation. She said that Lesner had been missing since April 30, 1969, last seen getting into a car with one of Carmine's crew. On the tape, Lesner, who Winograd accused of stealing $30,000, was fearful for his life. Mrs. Winograd assured him that he had nothing to fear, from either her or the kid, in apparent reference to Carmine. Yasgur asked the witness, "When you say Lesnar stole $30,000 from you, you meant that he stole it from your business, a business that Mr. Persico has an interest in, correct?" "No." "Mrs. Winograd, during the course of the conversation, did you not tell Mr. Lesnar that Mr. Persico, in your language, feels like a jerk-off? If you could do this to him and he do nothing about it?" "Yes, I said that." "Now, when you said that, if you could do this to him in the context of the conversation, isn't it a fact that you were referring to what Lesnar had done when he had stolen the $30,000? "He stole that money from me." "Mrs. Winograd, what I'm asking you is, in the context of the conversation, when you said that to Lesnar, if you could do this, isn't it quite clear that you were referring to the fact that Lesnar had stolen the $30,000 from the money-lending business?" "I was talking in the heat of anger. I don't know exactly what I meant." "Did you ever discuss your business with Mr. Persico?" "No, never." "Have you ever discussed with Carmine Persico the fact that Lesnar has, as you previously testified, stolen money from you or the lending business?" "Absolutely not. I think I told Mr. Persico that Mr. Lesnar had robbed me, but not from my money-lending business." "Did Mr. Persico ever warn Lesnar to stay out of the fur market?" "No, that was a figment of Mr. Lesnar's imagination." And on it went. Not just with this witness, but with all the other prosecution witnesses as well. No one could testify that Carmine did anything illegal ever. So it came as no surprise that, on December 8, 1971, the jury found Carmine not guilty on all charges. When Judge Postel first prohibited the press and public from the courtroom, Carmine's defense team filed suit. The courts being the way they were, by the time a court got around to looking at the suit, Carmine's trial was over. In January 1972, the Court of Appeals briefly considered Carmine's request for a retrial, but he was acquitted, so no new trial was necessary. The subject didn't go away completely, however, as legal efforts were made to prevent Judge Postel's rulings from happening again. In March, the seven-man New York State Supreme Court unanimously decided that Judge Postel had been wrong when he closed Carmine's trial to the press and the public. Right to a public trial meant just what it said. However, again, because of Carmine's acquittal, the Supreme Court dismissed a lawsuit brought by the 5 reporters who had been kicked out of the courtroom. The dismissal was not because the reporters' claims were without merit, but because the trial was long over and the relief requested now served no purpose. In his decision, Chief Judge Stanley Fuld explained that it was up to the judge to prove there was an imminent threat to the integrity of the trial before taking action to limit the First Amendment's guarantees, and Judge Postel had not done that. "You don't bar the press," Fuld wrote, "you sequester the jury." The 1959 hijacking still hung increasingly heavy around Carmine Persico's neck, a bloated and blindfolded albatross. When Carmine was first in the case years before, he'd been offered a deal. Plead guilty, do 3 years, parole in 1. Instead, Carmine fought and fought and fought. Good news for the lawyers he hired, but not so great for him. He was eventually sentenced to 14 years. As he listened to the judge, his first thought was of how much he'd changed, grown, since the crime was committed. At the hijacking, he'd been a dour-faced, sweet punk. Now he was a dapper and wealthy man. He'd played cards with billionaires and fucked movie stars. He'd been offered 3, got 14. Was it a blunder? Best bet is that he felt he'd done the right thing. It was worth it, just to tell those federal fucks to go fuck themselves. "Mushy, you and Tommy are boss while I'm gone," Carmine said to his cousin, Andy Russo, referring to Thomas DeBella. According to sources close to Carmine, he ran the Colombo family from behind bars, using his brothers Alphonse, Teddy Boy, and Hugh McIntosh as messengers to Mush. As boss, Carmine demonstrated a new level of cooperation with the Gambino family, making himself indispensable to the boss of bosses. Just as Carmine was going into prison, Joey Gallo was getting out. Crazy Joey was angry and suffering from a genuine personality disorder. He just wanted to kill everybody. Once again, war was in the wind. Tensions grew between the family, now known as the Colombos, and that old thorn in their ass, the President Street Boys. Carmine, as he adjusted to prison life, came to understand that there could be no peace on the outside until the Gallos were dead. On April 7, 1972, crazy Joey Gallo was killed at Umberto's clam house. Because my dad worked with Joey and the guys who were supposed to guard Joey, I learned a lot of inside dope on what went down that night, and still none of it makes much sense. Earlier in the year, we'd noticed that Joey wasn't on the block as much as the old days. We'd still see him once or twice a week, but that was it. He'd moved on. He had a new wife and a new life in the city. He had to know he was a target, yet he'd walk around without protection. He thought the Colombos were too chicken shit to shoot him. Kid Blast tried to convince Joey that being careful out there wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of wisdom. Joey heard him and didn't hear him. He had my godfather, Bobby Darrow, and Pete the Greek Diapolis watching his back, and he said that was enough for him. But it wasn't. Once the bullets started flying, Bobby and Pete did him no good at all. Bobby had met a girl that night, and Joey sent him off with her to have fun. Pete was a guy no one liked because he was all muscle and no brain, but he'd been a pretty good bodyguard up there until the very end. Joey got shot dead, and Pete the Greek got shot in the ass. According to the stories we heard, the hit was ordered somewhat spontaneously. A guy named Joe Lupicelli spotted Joey and his family coming into Umberto's and quietly slipped a dime into a nearby payphone. He called Yak. Yak said he'd take care of it. Pete the Greek maintained his innocence with a desperate fervor right from the start, but was eyed suspiciously from then on. That same weekend, when Joey was whacked, one of the New York dailies ran an expose on the Colombo family. It said that Carmine was in charge, but that Joey's death was not a Colombo hit. Not that hitting Joey in retaliation for the vegetabilization of Joe Colombo didn't occur to Carmine. He must have wanted Joey dead very badly, but he reportedly decided against it because he didn't want it to interfere with one of his perpetual upcoming court appeals, another refrain that would follow Carmine from cell to cell. If this story was true, Yak apparently didn't consider Carmine's plight when he decided Joey Gallo had to go, knowing well that Carmine would not be heartbroken by the news. On April 7, 1972, the same day Joey Gallo was murdered, Gennaro Ciprio, a Brooklyn restaurateur, was shot to death by a rooftop sniper as he exited his place onto the sidewalk. This sounds like the same Persico sniper who later took out a couple of Gallo guys on President Street, shootings to which, as you'll see, I had an uncomfortable proximity. We don't know if Joey Gallo and Ciprio were friends, but interestingly, Ciprio was rumored to have been the guy at Columbus Circle that killed Colombo's shooter and disappeared. Officially, the case of the shooter was wide open, without suspects. So many had a motive, apparently, that it was hard to narrow it down. Police investigators learned that, since Joey's death, members of the Persico crew had been hiding out in upstate New York, in the town of Saugerties. There, Carmine had an impressive compound, where it was cool and quiet in the summer, a 9-bedroom villa built on 59 acres of land. The farm was called the Blue Mountain Manor Horse Farm. It was Carmine's, even though, for tax purposes, the on-paper ownership shuffled around, at one time technically belonging to Donnie Shacks. Watching the farm from afar with really good binoculars, investigators could see that the men at the farm always carried long arms, either shotguns or rifles, whenever they went outside.